The frost clung to the metal walls of the makeshift barracks as Oberfeldwebel Dieter Hallmann cupped his hands over a tiny, guttering flame. The winter wind outside cut like a blade, slicing through wool, leather, and whatever remained of German resolve. He had been captured only 3 days earlier, during a chaotic retreat on the Western Front. 3 days since the fuel gauge in his Panzer IV had fallen to 0. 3 days since his crew abandoned the vehicle and fled on foot. 3 days since they learned the most humiliating truth of the war. The Americans had captured more German tanks through fuel starvation than through fire. But nothing prepared him for what he saw that morning. As the sun rose over the American POW camp, Dieter stepped out of his barracks and froze in disbelief. A line of U.S. soldiers was hauling metal drums across the snow, sloshing the contents with casual indifference. The smell reached him first. Gasoline. Pure, precious gasoline. A scent that had become rarer than gold on the German front. He watched, numb and speechless, as the Americans pried open the drums and poured the fuel into metal trays positioned under the barracks air vents. A match flicked, a roar of flame. Warm air flooded the wooden shelters. The Americans were burning gasoline, burning it to heat the sleeping quarters of enemy prisoners. For Dieter, the moment detonated with the force of a shell burst. He had spent the last 2 years measuring fuel in spoonfuls. He had watched tank crews fight over half-empty jerry cans. He had seen battalion operations canceled because supply trucks couldn't spare 10 liters. He had listened to panzer commanders scream into radios as their offensive stalled on empty fuel lines. And in the end, he had surrendered not because he was defeated, but because his engine had died. And now, here in captivity, the enemy was using gasoline as a convenience? As a heater? Something to be thrown into trays like kitchen scraps? The humiliation was unbearable. The implications were devastating. Behind him, another German POW whispered with hollow disbelief. If they can afford to burn gasoline for this, then we never had a chance. Dieter didn't answer. He understood perfectly. This single act, mundane to an American, catastrophic to a German, revealed the truth German generals had hidden from their soldiers, from their Führer, and perhaps from themselves. The United States had so much fuel that it could waste it. Germany had so little fuel that it could not fight. This was not simply an economic difference. It was not merely logistical. It was psychological, existential, a collapse of belief. For years, German officers had preached that willpower, discipline, and tactical brilliance would overcome material shortages. They insisted that German ingenuity could compensate for American abundance. They claimed that the decadent United States lacked the warrior spirit to endure. But in that moment, watching gasoline flames dance casually beneath wooden barracks, every German prisoner understood the truth with painful clarity. America's abundance wasn't decadence. It was victory. For the German military, fuel scarcity was a daily torment. Operational plans were drafted not around strategy, but around fuel allocations, measured in liters, not barrels. Panzer divisions that once spearheaded lightning campaigns were reduced to static fire brigades, hoarding precious fuel for emergency counterattacks. Luftwaffe units grounded entire squadrons, unable to train new pilots. U-boats ran coastal routes instead of deep ocean patrols. Half of the Wehrmacht's transport still relied on horses, not engines. The German army rationed fuel the way a drowning man rations air. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was living inside a different universe, one powered by oil fields that seemed infinite, refineries that never slept, and a logistical system that delivered millions of gallons daily like clockwork. American soldiers drove trucks for tasks Germans assigned to bicycles. They used jeeps for errands Germans performed on foot. They warmed tents, cooked meals, powered generators, lit airfields, and ran entire mechanized corps on a river of gasoline so vast that even their waste, yes, even their waste, outstripped Germany's entire strategic reserve. When German POWs saw Americans burning gasoline for heat, they did not see comfort. They saw empire. They saw an enemy whose resources were beyond comprehension. They saw a war already lost. And in this moment, quiet, ordinary, and utterly devastating, the center of gravity in the German mind shifted. Many German officers later recalled that the collapse of their morale did not come from Allied offensives or battlefield defeats. It came from the realization that they had been fighting a nation whose fuel supply alone constituted a second army. This script explores that devastating contrast. How German generals micromanaged fuel down to the liter, while American forces possessed such overwhelming petroleum abundance that they could treat fuel as disposable. It examines how this disparity shaped strategy, shattered morale, and ultimately revealed the deeper truth about World War II. Germany did not lose the war through battlefield inferiority. It lost because it fought an enemy whose industrial and logistical power exceeded every calculation, every expectation, and every dream of the Reich. And nothing embodied that truth more than a campfire of burning gasoline, a flame that warmed American prisoners even as it extinguished the last illusions of German victory. Dieter Hallmann's shock in the POW camp echoed the silent horror that had been creeping through the German officer corps for years. Long before gasoline flames warmed American barracks, the German military had been fighting a war shaped, constrained, and ultimately suffocated by fuel scarcity. Every campaign, every maneuver, every armored thrust carried the hidden weight of an unspoken truth. Germany did not command its fuel. Fuel commanded Germany. From the very beginning, the Reich entered the war with an energy deficit so severe that it bordered on suicidal. The Wehrmacht marched into Poland on synthetic gasoline produced from coal. The Luftwaffe soared on carefully rationed aviation fuel synthesized in vast chemical plants that devoured electricity and manpower. The early triumphs of Blitzkrieg masked a structural fragility. Every kilometer gained was a kilometer of fuel consumed, fuel Germany could not replace at an industrial pace. By 1941, as panzers clawed their way across the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, fuel shortages were already emerging as a chronic sickness. Commanders learned to interpret maps differently from their American or British counterparts. For the Germans, mobility was not measured by terrain or weather. Mobility was measured by how many thousands of liters could be scraped together for a single division on a single day. Every offensive began with a question, not where do we strike, but can we afford to strike at all? No matter how skilled the general, no matter how experienced the tank crew, no matter how carefully crafted the plan, German operations revolved around the tyranny of supply. Panzers that once symbolized unstoppable mechanized warfare now sat immobilized for want of fuel that arrived too slowly, too unpredictably, or sometimes not at all. Whole battalions remained parked because headquarters hoarded reserves for a hypothetical breakthrough. Tanks were towed on rail cars to avoid consuming precious gasoline, as if saving their strength for a decisive moment that never came. Some units drained fuel from wrecked vehicles in desperate attempts to keep a fraction of their strength mobile. On the Eastern Front, commanders learned bitterly that fuel could vanish into mud as quickly as into engines. A division that consumed 30,000 liters on paper often consumed 50,000 in reality as trucks bogged down in black Ukrainian soil. German logisticians calculated fuel not in barrels, but in parts per thousand, measuring losses, evaporation, and theft with an accountant's despair. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe, the jewel of early German warfare, slowly choked to death on its own shortages. Training flights were cut. Pilots graduated with fewer flying hours than American beginners. Entire squadrons were grounded. The skies that once roared with Messerschmitt engines grew silent, not because the pilots lacked bravery, but because their planes lacked fuel. Veteran flyers mourned the loss of their comrades, not to enemy fire, but to the slow starvation of their units. Even the feared U-boat arm faced the same nightmare. Germany's submarine pens were filled with engines ready to strike the Atlantic, but their crews waited days for fuel deliveries that crawled across threatened rail lines. The wolf packs that once terrorized convoys dwindled not from Allied supremacy alone, but because there was no petroleum to feed their diesel engines. And all the while, German intelligence continued to record accurately that the United States was drowning in fuel. It was the most painful contrast of the war. German generals issued fuel in liters. American commanders issued fuel in millions of gallons. The Wehrmacht measured fuel reserves by weight. The U.S. Army measured them by the distance they could afford to waste. Germany built synthetic plants that devoured coal and manpower. America tapped oil fields that stretched from Texas to California to the Gulf. Germany worried about weather, pipeline sabotage, refinery bombings. America worried about how to transport its near-limitless supply quickly enough to the front. The most cruel twist was that German officers fully understood the depth of their predicament, even if their leaders refused to. They saw the operational paralysis creeping through their units like rot. They knew their armies were becoming less mechanized with each passing month. They watched Allied forces, fueled by a petroleum empire, grow more mobile, more confident, more unstoppable. And in private, they admitted what they could never say aloud. We are losing this war not on the battlefield, but in the fuel depots. Letters, diaries, and field reports record a slow, agonizing realization. Panzer commanders increasingly found themselves strategizing not around enemy positions, but around fuel priorities. Staff officers argued endlessly about allocations too small to change the course of any operation. Division leaders pleaded for more gasoline, only to be told that their allotment was final, their requests impossible. Meanwhile, the Americans were building what German officers would later call the miracle of supply. Across France, Belgium, and the Low Countries, endless convoys of U.S. trucks, burning gasoline at rates that horrified German logisticians, carried fuel to the front. Red Ball Express convoys thundered along designated roads day and night, delivering tens of thousands of barrels without pause. Engineers laid flexible fuel pipelines under the English Channel and across liberated territory, pumping fuel like water through arteries that no German planner had imagined. Das shocking truth war, dass amerikanische Forcen used mehr fuel in einem Tag, than Germany used in einer Woche. Diese Disparität klafft deep psychologisches Gas. German soldiers begannen fühlen, als ob sie einen Phantom Enemy fighten, einen whose strength grew mit every mile they retreated. Amerikanische Tanks manövrierten frei, indifferent zu Distance. Amerikanische Aircraft dominierten die Skies, weil sie können Tränen endlos. Amerikanische Trucks criss-cross the continent mit Gasoline sloshing carelessly in ihren Tanks. Und worst of all, amerikanische soldiers treated fuel nicht als sacred, but als ordinary. German troops who surrendered on the Western Front oft experienced their greatest humiliation not in defeat, but in captivity. They saw jeeps left idling for hours to keep radios warm. They saw trucks driving short distances that German units would never waste gasoline on. They saw barrels of fuel stacked casually, not guarded like treasure. Die sahen Amerikaner cleaning their hands with rags dipped in gasoline, something that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. But the breaking point came, again and again, in POW camps. German prisoners saw gasoline used for tasks their own army couldn't justify, even in the most desperate offensives. Heating, cleaning, lighting, burning trash, thawing equipment, starting fires. It wasn't just abundance, it was abundance displayed with indifference. Fuel was so cheap, so plentiful, so common, that the Americans could waste it without a second thought. To German prisoners like Dieter Hollmann, this was not an insult. It was a revelation. A revelation that Germany's defeat had been sealed long before they reached the front lines. A revelation that courage could not replace petroleum. A revelation that ingenuity could not substitute for millions of barrels. A revelation that strategy could not function without fuel to drive it forward. And the most devastating realization of all, the Americans had won before the Germans even began rationing. Für die deutschen Generals, die still klangen zu hoffen in 1944, der größte Threat war nicht Allied Tanks oder Bombers. Es war eine reisende Tide von amerikanischem Fuel. Eine Flut so vast und so konstant, dass es renderte den Währendkonzept von Scarcity obsolet. Während die Wehrmacht einen Wor von Teelöffeln führte, die USA entließen einen Ozean. Und als das Ozean surgte über Europa, die psychologische Distanz zwischen den zwei Armeen weitete in einen Abyss, das no amount of Disziplin, Doktrin oder Heroismus konnte bridgen. Der deutsche High-Kommando hat lang tollt es selbst eine komfortable Story, dass die Amerikaner wären Amateure, spirituell weak, lacking the will to fight, softened by civilian life. But the first time a German logistics officer walked past a US supply depot in Normandy, sehen Rau auf Rau von tauernden fuel drums, stacked like monuments to industrial power, unterstand, dass Willpower war irrelevant. Die Amerikaner, es sieht, hatten replaced will with infrastructure. German divisions on the front often received fuel in increments so small, they seemed like mockery. 2000 Liter für ein ganzes Regiment, während ein singles Panzerbataillon 20.000 brauchte, nur um in Position zu rücken. Meanwhile, American armored divisions were consuming tens of thousands of gallons each day, sometimes more, as if gasoline wäre nichts mehr als das Blut kursend durch ihre Venen. To the Germans, the Red Ball Express looked like madness. Columns of trucks burning massive quantities of fuel simply to deliver bigger quantities of fuel. The irony war bitter. German supply officers debated endlos über ein paar Dutzend jerrycans, while Americans willingly burned gasoline to transport gasoline, in ein endlos logistisches Uroboros, das Germany könnte nimmer replizieren. The German diaries von this period reveal ein haunting sense of inevitabilität. Officers wrote with quiet despair about hearing American engines rumble through the night, an unbroken hum that seemed to vibrate through the earth. What they were hearing was not a single army. It was a petroleum empire in motion. The United States did not need to preserve momentum. It generated momentum as naturally as a river generates its current. And this current swept away everything the Germans thought they understood about mechanized warfare. A German panzer division advancing at full speed could not sustain momentum for more than a few days before gasoline ran dry. But American armored divisions could move, halt, reposition, advance again, all without a meaningful pause. Their tanks maneuvered not with caution, but with confidence, turning wide flanking movements that German generals could never anticipate, because such maneuvers would have been suicidal for the fuel-starved Wehrmacht. In truth, the Germans were not fighting one American army, they were fighting two. The first was the visible force, the men, tanks, aircraft, and artillery of the U.S. Army. The second was invisible, the refineries, pipelines, convoys, fuel docks, and truck fleets that powered them. This second army was the one the Germans could never defeat, the one that delivered victory in a steady drumbeat of millions of gallons. The collapse of German strategic flexibility became inevitable. A plan that looked brilliant on paper fell apart when the fuel allocations arrived. Never enough, never on time, never sufficient to turn vision into action. German generals placed pins on maps, drew sweeping arrows, and wrote orders with elegant precision, but the fuel never matched the ambition. Offensive shrank, maneuvers shriveled. The once feared operational art of the Wehrmacht, what had stunned the world in 1940, became a hollow ritual. Meanwhile, American fuel abundance created a new kind of warfare, mobile, responsive, and often improvisational. Commanders ordered entire battalions to reposition because it felt right, something unthinkable for the Germans, who treated fuel like a sacred relic. U.S. armored units executed feints, probing attacks, rapid redeployments, and experimental tactics simply because they could. If a maneuver failed, they burned fuel and tried something else. If it succeeded, they burned fuel to exploit the success. This freedom broke the spirit of German men who had spent months trapped inside a shrinking world of rationing and retreat. They saw American units bypass villages not worth fighting for, then wheel back hours later with engines roaring and tanks refueled, a tempo that belonged to another planet. The Wehrmacht felt ancient, fossilized, trapped inside a pre-industrial calculus of limits, while the Americans moved with the carefree confidence of a nation that believed distance and time were inconveniences, not constraints. The final collapse of morale came not during combat, but during surrender. German POWs marching under guard saw fuel trucks parked casually behind American lines, engines idling, warmth radiating from their cabins. They watched jeeps performing errands so trivial, a courier delivering mail, an officer scouting a campsite, that German soldiers wondered if the Americans even understood how precious fuel was. One POW later recalled that the most humiliating moment of his war was seeing an American private drive a truck less than 50 meters rather than walk. 50 meters, he whispered. We would have walked 5 kilometers. We would have hauled the cargo on our backs. But the deepest wound came from witnessing fuel used as comfort rather than strategy. German POW camps in American hands often maintained heated barracks, while German front-line units froze in the field. American guards lit gasoline burners to warm their meals, while German units boiled snow to ration water. The casual normalcy of American fuel use, its omnipresence, its banality, destroyed any illusion that Germany was fighting a balanced war. In the end, the Germans did not lose faith in their weapons. They lost faith in the math, and math is merciless. It told them that even perfect tactics could not overcome infinite supply. It told them that courage could not refill an empty fuel tank. It told them that a machine without gasoline was just scrap metal. It told them that their defeat had been sealed not by Allied superiority in firepower, but by the simple, brutal fact of fuel abundance. When Dieter Hallmann saw gasoline burning beneath American barracks, he understood a truth that should have reached him years earlier. Germany had been fighting a petroleum civilization with the reserves of a region, and the Americans could afford to burn, waste, spill, heat, or discard more fuel in a week than the Wehrmacht could count on for an entire campaign. It was not a war of armies. It was a war of resources, and Germany had marched into that war already defeated. For Germany, fuel scarcity was a constant torment. For the United States, fuel abundance was an invisible inheritance, a quiet force shaping every doctrine, every machine, every tactical decision. The gulf between these two realities was so vast that, by 1944, the German and American armies were no longer fighting the same kind of war. They occupied different technological epochs, one bound by shortages, the other liberated by surplus, one forced to conserve, the other empowered to experiment. And this divide reshaped the battlefield into something that German generals could neither predict nor comprehend. In the German worldview, mechanized warfare demanded caution. Every movement consumed precious fuel. Every kilometer drained reserves that might never be replenished. One forced to conserve, the other empowered to experiment. And this divide reshaped the battlefield into something that German generals could neither predict nor comprehend. The Germans crafted plans with the precision of surgeons, calculating routes that minimized engine use, cutting training hours, and even restricting scouting patrols because reconnaissance vehicles drank gasoline that might be needed later. They conserved fuel as if they were conserving blood. But the American war was defined by motion, unceasing, unrestrained, and fueled by a logistical engine that seemed inexhaustible. U.S. armored units did not plan operations around fuel scarcity. They assumed fuel would be there, and it always was. This assumption allowed American commanders to innovate, adapt, and improvise with a freedom that German officers found reckless, even insane. Yet it worked, because behind every American tank, truck, jeep, and aircraft was a technological infrastructure designed for constant movement. Nowhere was this more evident than in the way the two armies conceived mobility. A mechanized doctrine grew increasingly defensive, constrained by dwindling reserves. Tanks were deployed in short, decisive bursts, then withdrawn to preserve their remaining fuel. Divisions that had once swept across continents now found themselves tied to narrow sectors, too thirsty to maneuver. The panzers that had danced across France in 1940 were reduced to statues by 1944, magnificent machines trapped inside the prison of empty fuel tanks. American mechanized doctrine, by contrast, evolved into an art of perpetual motion. U.S. commanders embraced sweeping flanking maneuvers, armored thrusts that stretched dozens of miles, and rapid exploitation tactics that seemed to violate the physical limits of warfare. Shermans dashed across open fields, repositioned on distant ridges, supported infantry over vast distances, and reassembled seamlessly elsewhere by nightfall. German observers wrote in disbelief that American tanks appeared to move without pause, day and night, as if fueled by the air itself. Diese Perzeption from enemy machines that never tired, never paused, never faltered, carried a devastating psychologische weight. German soldiers whispered that the Americans possessed ghost divisions because their armored units appeared in multiple sectors with impossible speed. But the truth was not supernatural. It was infrastructural. US units weren't ghosts. They waren Manifestationen eines industriellen Welt, das Germany konnte nicht fassen. The Americans could afford to waste fuel on reconnaissance sweeps, on exploratory maneuvers, even on routine errands. Und diese Waste, vom German Perspektive, bekam eine offensive Waffe. American commanders learned that speed itself war eine Waffe. Wann macht möglich durch eine logistische Inlandsee von Petroleum? When Patton's forces swept across France faster than any German intelligence model predicted, it wasn't because of brilliant strategy alone. It was because the American armies were powered by a mobile fuel empire. Thousands of trucks, hundreds of depots, and millions of gallons flowing like a river behind the front. German officers, trained to expect attritional limits, simply could not adapt to an enemy that operated with what seemed like infinite endurance. They were trapped inside doctrines crafted for scarcity, while the Americans forged doctrines for plenty. German army groups waited anxiously for their next fuel shipments. American forces requested more gasoline as readily as ordering lunch. The Germans measured fuel in liters, the Americans measured it in futures. This technological advantage penetrated every aspect of the war effort. American air power, for example, was not merely superior because of better production numbers. It was superior because pilots could train endlessly. German pilots flew as little as possible to conserve fuel, entering battle undertrained and exhausted. American aviators flew daily, mastering skills that German veterans struggled to match. A Luftwaffe ace once remarked with bitter admiration that American pilots fly more in a month of training than our boys do in a year. Even communications networks reflected this divide. American radio trucks, powered by gasoline generators, formed continuous webs of command and control. German radio units, lacking fuel, were forced to shut down engines, move sparingly, and ration battery use. The Americans drowned the battlefield in electricity. The Germans fought inside darkness. American engineers built portable airfields that absorbed enormous fuel consumption. German engineers built camouflaged bases that saved every drop they could. American tank destroyers patrolled continuously. German tank destroyers conserved fuel for decisive ambushes. American divisions rotated fresh units constantly because transport was cheap. German divisions decayed in place because transport was unaffordable. The most painful irony was that German technological sophistication, the quality of their machines, their engineering, their craftsmanship, became meaningless when compared to American logistical supremacy. What use was the legendary Panther tank if it ran dry before reaching the battlefield? What value was the precision of a Messerschmitt engine if it sat idle on the runway? What power did a U-boat possess if it spent half its mission limping home on rationed diesel? German officers spoke proudly of quality, but quality without fuel became museum pieces on a battlefield that demanded movement. And the Americans knew this. They weaponized abundance. They turned gasoline into strategy. They turned engines into doctrine. They turned movement into inevitability. The ultimate humiliation for the Germans was realizing that the Americans were not even fighting at full effort. They were fighting comfortably, fluidly, their movements cushioned by a logistical surplus so vast that they could afford to treat fuel as a convenience. German POWs watched American guards pour fuel into lanterns and heaters and realized with anguish that the enemy had been using more fuel for comfort than Germany could use for combat. This psychological devastation ran deeper than any tank penetration or artillery barrage. It created a fracture in German morale that no propaganda could repair. The soldiers who had marched with pride across Europe now understood that they had been fighting an opponent whose true strength lay not in bravery or luck, but in a technological and industrial civilization operating on a scale beyond their comprehension. Germany had entered a mechanized war with the fuel reserves of a regional power. America had entered with the fuel reserves of a continent. And no amount of discipline, courage, or tactical genius could overcome that difference. In the final months of the war, as the Wehrmacht retreated across every front and German cities crumbled under Allied bombardment, the collapse of morale did not come from battlefield defeat alone. It came from a deeper, more intimate realization, one that struck German soldiers not in the trenches, but in the quiet moments after surrender. It came from witnessing how the Americans treated fuel, not as treasure, not as life, not as the beating heart of an army, but as something so ordinary it could be spent without thought. In that contrast, German soldiers saw the truth of their own insignificance in the industrial age. They were fighting not an enemy army, but an entire civilization powered by abundance. The shock of this revelation often began the moment German troops entered captivity. For men who had marched across half of Europe on half rations, who had drained the last drops from abandoned tanks, who had begged quartermasters for liters like beggars asking for bread, the American world seemed unreal. They saw trucks idling for hours while guards chatted lazily. They saw generators roaring simply to keep coffee warm. They saw aircraft engines run for maintenance checks that consumed more fuel in 10 minutes than a German division received in a day. Prisoners stared at these scenes with a numb disbelief that slowly broke into despair. How could they reconcile the months they spent rationing fuel with the casual extravagance around them? How could they understand a world where gasoline burned in stoves, lamps, heaters, tools of comfort, not survival? They had been taught that the American soldier was soft, decadent, driven by materialism. Yet here they stood in a camp heated by fuel that Germany would have traded steel, guns, and blood to possess. The deepest humiliation came at night, when the air grew cold and American guards lit gasoline heaters beneath the wooden floorboards of the barracks. The warmth spread through the room like a betrayal. German prisoners felt the heat on their skin and hated themselves for enjoying it. They knew their comrades were freezing at the front, clinging to life in trenches without firewood or proper coats. They knew panzer crews were sleeping in unheated hulls, breath freezing on the interior steel. And yet here, in captivity, they were warmed by the very substance their army lacked most. Dieter Hallmann was not alone in feeling that this warmth was an accusation. Many POWs later admitted that the moment they saw Americans using fuel so casually, they stopped believing in German victory altogether. It wasn't defeat. They had already surrendered. It was the emotional death of the idea that their struggle had ever been equal. The flame under the barracks became a symbol of everything their generals had hidden from them, that Germany had marched into a mechanized war without the means to sustain mechanized forces, and their sacrifices had been demanded in service of a delusion. This psychological collapse spread through the ranks like a quiet plague. Soldiers who once believed in German discipline now envied American ease. Men who once scoffed at American materialism now understood that materialism in war was salvation. The Reich had told them that fuel shortages were temporary, that heroic spirit mattered more than gasoline, that the Americans were weak and would break under pressure. But standing before a barrel of fuel burning simply to keep a barracks warm, the German prisoners realized that everything they had been told was backward. It was not the Americans who were weak. It was the Germans who had been lied to. This ideological disintegration was the most dangerous contagion for the German high command. The officers who were still fighting at the front depended on belief. Belief in German superiority, belief in destiny, belief in the Führer's guidance. But their men wrote letters home describing life in captivity that made these beliefs impossible to maintain. They burned gasoline to heat their prisoners, one captured lieutenant wrote to his wife. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what kind of enemy we were facing? Some letters never reached their destinations, intercepted by German censors who feared their effect. But the truth spread anyway, passed by rumor from unit to unit, a corrosive whisper that undermined every speech, every order, every promise of victory. German soldiers began surrendering more readily, believing resistance was futile. Entire companies laid down their arms at the mere sight of American supply convoys, convinced that no amount of bravery could compete with such overwhelming abundance. Even German officers, trained to maintain iron discipline, could not shield themselves from this creeping despair. They saw their operational reports filled with phrases like insufficient fuel, reserve exhausted, movement halted due to shortage. They read intelligence briefings describing Allied supply flows so vast they bordered on incomprehensible. They received frantic messages from the front demanding fuel that simply did not exist. And then, in the final insult, they learned from their captured men that the Americans used gallons of the precious substance simply to heat tents and barracks. The emotional blow was devastating. It forced German officers to confront a terrible truth. Their soldiers had not been defeated by superior tactics or superior courage. They had been abandoned by a regime that asked them to fight a war without providing the means to fight it. The Reich had promised victory through willpower, through ideology, through racial superiority. But the Americans had achieved victory through supply chains, logistics, and a fuel empire so vast it made mockery of German sacrifice. In the final days of the war, as Berlin collapsed and the last reserves of fuel evaporated, many German officers privately admitted that the psychological damage created by American fuel abundance may have done more to break the Wehrmacht than any battlefield defeat. The knowledge that their enemy could afford to burn fuel for comfort while they starved for it in battle struck at the core of their identity. It told them, unmistakably, that Germany had been outclassed not just strategically, but civilizationally. The flame that warmed the POW barracks did more than melt the ice. It melted the last illusions holding German morale together. When the war finally ended and the smoke cleared from Europe's shattered cities, historians began sifting through the ruins of armies, ideologies, and nations. They cataloged the battles, the commanders, the machines, the legends of Kursk, Normandy, El Alamein, the Ardennes. But beneath every triumph and catastrophe ran a quieter, more relentless truth. The Second World War had been won long before the first shot was fired, not by tanks or planes or generals, but by the world's largest and most unassailable source of petroleum. Fuel, more than any doctrine or weapon, was the axis upon which the war turned. Germany had entered the conflict believing that willpower could substitute for resources, that courage could compensate for scarcity, that ideology could override industrial reality. But the war revealed a harsher truth, one Dieter Hollmann and countless other German soldiers only understood when the warmth of an American fuel-fed stove reached their frozen hands. The United States fought a war powered by abundance so overwhelming that it transformed strategy itself. Germany fought a war powered by scarcity so severe that it strangled every plan before it could take shape. The Americans maneuvered freely because fuel freed them. The Germans maneuvered cautiously because fuel chained them. In every theater, at every moment, this difference determined outcomes. American tanks could outflank because they could afford to move. American aircraft could dominate because they could afford to fly. American logistics could surge because they could afford to operate around the clock. America's petroleum empire powered an army that treated movement as a right rather than a privilege, a force that did not fear distance or time because both could be conquered with gasoline. Germany, by contrast, exhausted itself fighting the laws of physics. Panzer divisions became static monuments to a vanished moment of early war glory. Luftwaffe squadrons stood grounded, their engines silent. U-boats rotted at their docks. Infantry divisions marched on foot like armies from a century earlier. Operational imagination shrank, and with it, morale. In the end, the crushing psychological blow dealt by American fuel abundance did more than demoralize German soldiers. It shattered the mental framework of the Wehrmacht. The realization that the enemy could burn gasoline simply to keep prisoners warm carried a symbolic finality that no battlefield defeat could equal. It told German soldiers that they had been fighting a war that never could have been won. It exposed the fatal lie at the heart of their nation's strategy, that spirit could overcome supply, that will could overcome want, that Germany could challenge a mechanized superpower without the means to mechanize itself. It was not American cruelty that broke German morale. It was American comfort. The flame beneath the POW barracks was not an insult. It was a revelation. It revealed the true shape of the modern world, a world where industrial capacity was the ultimate weapon, where oil fields mattered more than speeches, where supply trucks mattered more than slogans, and where the nation with the longest logistical reach would inevitably determine history's direction. The Americans did not need to prove superiority through rhetoric. They proved it with fuel. For the German officers who survived the war, many admitted privately and some publicly that the Wehrmacht had never truly fought the U.S. Army. They had fought the American production line, the American refinery, the American convoy, the American pipeline. They had fought a machine larger than any battlefield, larger even than Europe, and powered by a resource Germany could not create, synthesize, or imagine in the same quantities. And so the war ended, not with a single decisive moment, but with a realization that seeped slowly into the German consciousness. Their defeat was written in the geology of continents, in the refineries of Texas, in the convoys of the Atlantic, in the very physics of fuel consumption. The Americans had so much gasoline they could afford to waste it, not because they were careless, but because their abundance defined the modern world. In that sense, the burning fuel beneath the POW barracks was more than warmth. It was prophecy. A prophecy of a post-war era shaped by logistics, by petroleum empires, by industrial mass, by nations that understood that the true battlefield of the 20th century was not the front line, but the supply line. A prophecy that the future would belong not to the armies that shouted the loudest, but to the armies that moved the fastest and could keep moving longest. Germany lost not because it lacked bravery, but because it lacked fuel. America won not because it was destined to, but because its engines never stopped. And the soldiers who felt the heat of burning gasoline in their prison barracks knew, perhaps more clearly than any general, that the war had never been a contest of equals. Fuel was victory. Scarcity was defeat. And the warmth that melted frost from German hands did more than thaw their skin. It thawed the last illusions that had held their world together.